Okay, everybody, welcome to a series of podcasts I'd like to do about debt. Really want to do two podcasts on debt. The first one is going to be about personal debt, debt that we carry ourselves, and the second one is going to be on national debt, the United States debt, essentially. And I'm going to sort of compare and contrast those, see how they're similar and different, and what the current state of the national debt is now and whether or not that's a problem. But we're going to start with personal debt because this is the debt that you're more familiar with. Although, really, a lot of people misunderstand the whole concept of debt. So that's why I wanted to do this podcast. To define terms, debt is essentially money you borrow. So it's money that is owed. The weird thing about borrowing money is when you first borrow money, it always feels like you're richer because, suddenly if I go to the bank and I ask for $10,000, and they give me a check for $10,000, then I put that in my bank and suddenly I've got this higher balance and I feel richer. I look richer on paper. And so the weird thing about debt is when it comes to loans is, people don't really realize that when you take out a loan, you're poorer than you were before you took out the loan, always, 100% of the time. Because when you take out a loan, you owe the entire amount of the loan, plus you owe the interest on the loan. So it's as if somebody, came to you and said, okay, I'll give you $10 right now, but you have to give me $20 tomorrow. So if you take the $10, you might feel richer. It's like, okay, now I have $10, except that you actually owe this person 20. And so today you're richer, but tomorrow you're going to be far poorer. And that's what debt is. I mean, nobody's really doing you any favors usually when they give you a loan. Banks don't give out loans, to do favors for people. They give out loans because it makes them money. Because as soon as they give you the loan, if they believe that you're really going to pay back the loan, then they know that they're going to make money off of you, that you're going to end up paying them more than they paid you. So loan debt is essentially just a way of making you poorer. They give you some money, it makes you feel good to have the money, you can do things with it, but in the long term you're poorer because you owe that money, plus you owe extra money. So you're actually poorer than you were before you took out the debt. So thinking about it that way, how can there be any such thing as good debt? Right? I mean, if debt makes you poorer, which it does, then how can there be good debt? Well, good debt depends on what you do with that money. Okay, there are things you can do with money which could, at least theoretically, earn you extra money to pay back the loan, to pay back the interest on the loan, and maybe still have some left over. So if you use money that you borrow to, say, buy something that goes up in value or get an education or start a business that ends up being profitable for you, then it's possible for you to have used that money to get you something that'll earn you more than you have to pay back, in which case the debt was good for you. It actually didn't make you poor. In the end, it made you richer because it allowed you to earn extra money that allowed you to pay back the debt, pay back the interest, and still have something left over. So that's good debt. Good debt is when you borrow, but you borrow in order to get something that has at least the potential of earning you back more than what you borrowed, and more than what you borrowed plus the interest that you have to pay. So some examples of good debt. Say you borrow money to start a successful business. So you don't have enough cash on hand to start this business, but a bank's willing to loan you some money at some interest rate to help you start the business. So let's say bank loans you $100,000 at 5%. Now you use that 100,000, you start your business. If your business is successful and ultimately ends up earning back that 100,000 plus the 5% interest plus some more than that, then you've done good. You use that debt to finance a business that ended up earning you more than the debt. So now you're in a better financial position than you were before you took out the loan. And you wouldn't have been able to even start this business without the loan. So borrowing money to start a successful business is an example of good debt. Because ultimately, that debt made you money. Also, borrowing money to buy a home, assuming the home appreciates in value more than the value of the loan plus what you had to pay back. Now, homes actually have to appreciate quite a bit. If you take out typically a 30-year loan at say 6%, you can end up having to pay back over 30 years like 2.5 times the value of the loan. So your home would have to appreciate more than 2.5 times its value in 30 years in order for that debt to be good debt. But historically, over the last 30 years, homes have appreciated quite a bit more than that in value. And so for the most part, borrowing money to buy a home over the last 30 years has been good debt because the increase in home value outstripped what you had to borrow plus the interest on the mortgage. So, for example, my mom, back in the 1970s, mid-70s, bought a house for $60,000. Now she had to borrow to buy that house. I think she borrowed 40 or 50. But the house today is worth over $1 million. So she, of course, long ago, she repaid the loan on the house. So she ended up borrowing maybe $50,000. She ended up paying back maybe $100,000, $120,000. That was her total cost. Plus she probably sunk in another $40,000 or $50,000 in home improvements. So all in all, she put in about a little less than $200,000 into that house, but the house is worth $1 million. So she did really well. I mean, basically $800,000 in profit in those 30 years. Well, 50 years. Still, it's not bad. So the borrowing that she did in order to buy the house in the first place was a good investment for her. There's also borrowing money to pay for education, which lots of people do because most people can't afford college prices anymore. We talked about that in our inflation podcast. So you got to borrow money to get an education these days. Now, if your education leads you to a profession, to get a professional job that actually ends up paying a lot of money, then the investment in your education, the borrowing you did, might have been worth it because the extra earnings you made because of your, say, advanced degree now, you became a doctor, you became a lawyer, you got a business degree and got a good job on Wall Street. So the money you now earn from that profession is more than what you borrowed plus the interest you had to pay back on what you borrowed. So in that case, the money that you borrowed for education was worth it because the education ultimately led you to vastly improved earnings, which allowed you to make more money than you borrowed and that you had to pay an interest. Now, you got to be careful with education. There are a lot of recent studies that have shown that a lot of educational degrees are not worth it in the sense of you never really earn back what the degree cost. And that includes a lot of terminal bachelor's degrees. So a lot of people who borrow money to go to fancy institutions and get bachelor's degrees, but that's as far as they get. They get a bachelor's in something and that's all. Say I get a bachelor's in art or a bachelor's in English or whatever. If that's as far as I go, there aren't really very many lucrative jobs in most fields that require only a bachelor's degree. And I may have gone, depending on how expensive my college was, To get that bachelor's degree, I could have easily gone $50,000 to $100,000 in debt, which I have to pay back plus the interest on that money. So, I may end up paying back $150,000. That may be my total of what I owe, and I may never really make that back professionally. So, when you borrow to pay for education, you really have to be careful. And many studies have shown that there are only certain degrees, and mostly advanced degrees like masters and PhDs, where the money that you're going to borrow and spend to get that education will actually be paid back by your increased earnings. There's a whole lot of degrees where that will never happen, most likely. And you'll end up just being poor because of the money you borrowed for college and never making it back. So again, you got to be really careful with that, with borrowing for education. Education's gotten very expensive, and in many cases, it's not worth it. And of course, it's never worth it if you don't finish getting your degrees and certificates. So if you borrow money for education and then you drop out of school at some point, it almost certainly wasn't worth it. And that debt is just going to make you poorer. So, if you're seeing education simply as a means to the end of better earnings and a better profession, you have to be really, really careful about this. Plus, I think many of you know this, but of all the debt you can incur in your life, debt for student loans to pay for education is not dischargeable in bankruptcy. So that means that even if at some point you just declare bankruptcy to get rid of your debt, you can't get rid of your student loan debt that way. So if you owe $150,000 in student loans and you declare bankruptcy, you still, after the bankruptcy filings, you still owe $150,000 in student loans. So you just can't discharge it. And I think that's one of the more terrible laws that was ever passed in the United States, but that is the law currently. I'm hoping someday that changes, because other forms of debt are dischargeable. For example, credit card debt is dischargeable in bankruptcy. Medical debt is dischargeable in bankruptcy. So if you owe $100,000 to a hospital for uncovered medical bills, if you owe $50,000 on a credit card that your credit cards which you overcharged, you can't pay back, you can declare bankruptcy and wipe all that debt out. It goes to zero. But your student loan debt remains. So that's why you have to be particularly careful about the amount of money you take out for student loans and what you use it for. That is, what degree you're ultimately going for, whether it's likely to allow you to get a job that will allow you to pay back those student loans. Because you're going to have to pay them back. You can't discharge them. So the student loan debt situation is particularly tricky and requires some really careful thought and planning. I used to teach at community college, which I think most of you know is a way you can take all the college courses you need for the first 2 years, freshman and sophomore, without having to go to a major university. And community colleges are way cheaper than universities are, even public universities. They're just way cheaper. I do highly recommend, if you really want to save money on student debt as you're figuring out, what degree you want or going for a degree, I highly recommend doing your first couple of years at a community college. It's a really good way to save a lot of money on college education, just because community college tuitions are so much cheaper than university tuitions. And I think the education is comparable. Universities do have some educational advantages, but you can, if you go to a decent community college, you get a perfectly good college education for your first couple of years. And you can do it cheaply. By the way, community colleges mostly have good vocational programs too, which are far cheaper than those private vocational programs a lot of which were shut down under the Obama administration because they were basically ripping kids off. You know, these places like Wyotech Engineering and all that. You know, you can get perfectly good, you know, degrees and all certificates in all kinds of vocational fields from a regular community college for very little money. And a lot of times those pay better than what you would professions you would get from a regular college degree. For example, we have at the college I taught at, we had a welding program which led to a welding certificate. We had process technology, which allows people to work in refineries. We had automotive program, all kinds of things that, you know, once you get out of school, you're only in school in those programs for maybe a year and a half. And once you get out, you can get pretty good paying jobs almost right away. And if you do it at community college, you can get those certificates very cheap. Whereas if you get them at places, private colleges like, you know, the old Wyotech or Heald or whatever, you're paying a lot of money to get those certificates, and you can go into heavy debt. But there's no need to, because community colleges offer the same, and usually better quality and way cheaper. So I'm a big fan of community colleges, not just for academic training and transfer to university, but also for vocational training. Okay, let's see other examples of good debt. Borrowing money to buy a car. In general, cars are not good things to borrow money to get because cars are what are called depreciating assets, which means that they lose value pretty steadily over time. So it's not like a house where you can buy a house and it can actually go up in value. They usually do. But cars almost never go up in value after you buy them. They usually go down in value pretty quickly after you buy them. So generally borrowing money to buy a car is bad debt. But if the car gives you the mobility that you need in order to, say, get a job that pays better that's further away from where you live, then it might be worth it. So for example, let's suppose that close to where I live, I can't get a really good paying job. But if I can get, you know, do a commute of like 30 or 40 miles a day, I can get to a job that will pay way better. Well, obviously I'm going to need a car to do that. So in that case, borrowing money to buy a car might be good debt because it allows me to travel the distance I need in order to get the job that is going to pay me a lot better. So again, usually borrowing money to buy cars is bad debt, but there are situations where it can be good debt. Also borrowing money to pay for a successful investment. So let's say I borrow money to buy stocks and the stocks end up going way up in value. And they make enough money for me that I can pay off the loan, can pay off the interest on the loan, and I still have money. In that case, the money I borrowed was good debt. But for a lot of these, you know, it really depends, again, specifically on what you use it for and how that does. So if you look at examples of bad debt, you know, borrowing money to start a successful business is good debt. Borrowing money to start an unsuccessful business is bad debt. And of course, you don't know when you start the business whether it's going to be successful or not. So this is a gamble. You're gambling here with your financial future. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. Obviously, this is the only way to start a business in most cases, you know, and there are lots of businesses that succeed and do really well. But, you know, whenever you borrow money to start a business, there's always some risk involved. And so that kind of borrowing could be good or it could be bad, depending on how things ultimately turn out. Again, borrowing money for education, as we just talked about extensively, is good if it leads you to a good profession that pays really well, but it's bad if you drop out or if it doesn't lead you to a good profession that's going to allow you to pay back that loan. So just like borrowing money to start a business is risky because it can go well for you financially or badly, Borrowing money for an education is also risky. It can go well for you or it can go badly. It can end up making you richer or it can end up making you poor. Again, borrowing money to buy a car is a depreciating asset. So unless that car is really necessary for you to get a better job, it's going to be bad debt as far as making you poor ultimately. This investment thing, if you borrow money to buy successful investment instruments like stocks that go way up, then it's good. If you borrow money to pay for stocks that go down, then it's bad. Something that's almost always bad is borrowing money to pay for regular ongoing expenses like your rent or your food or your utility bills or depreciating assets like furniture, things that tend to lose value over time. Cars too, usually. So if you're borrowing money to pay regular expenses, to pay for depreciating assets like cars and furniture, or to if you're borrowing money to finance addictions, bad habits, all of that is bad debt. It's going to just make you poor. As soon as you take that money, you are poorer than you were. Even though your bank account looks better, you're poorer than you were because you owe that money and you owe the interest on it. So you actually have less money than you had before you took it. So those are just typical examples of good and bad debt. Now, if you're already in debt, is there a way to make that debt better debt? And the answer is sure. If you can trade the debt you have for lower interest debt. Because remember, when you borrow money, you owe the money back plus you owe the interest on the money. So let's say I've been using my credit cards and going into debt on my credit cards. Credit cards have notoriously high interest rates. A lot of them like 24, on any balance you don't pay back every month, like 24% a year. Huge interest rates. Interest rates that not that long ago were illegal. So let's suppose I owe $50,000 on my credit cards and I'm paying 24% interest. Which, if you do the math, if you owe $50,000 on credit cards and you can't really pay back much of the balance every month, so you owe 24% in interest. 24% of $50,000 is what, $12,000. So that means just the interest on that debt is $12,000 a year. So, if I have $50,000 on the credit cards and I pay back just the minimums on those credit cards, then the next year I owe $60,000 because of all the interest that's accumulated. And if I just pay the minimums on that, the next year I owe $70,000. So because the interest rate's so high and I can't even afford to really pay the interest on that debt, then every year I owe more and more and more and just get deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. So is there a way to make that debt better? Well, yeah, if you can pay off the credit card debt with cheaper debt that has lower interest rate. So for example, if somebody is willing to give me a loan, that's say an 8% interest loan for $50,000 at 8% interest, which I can use to pay off the $50,000 I owe the credit card companies at 24% interest. So then I still have no money, but I'm trading the 24% interest for an 8% interest. So my interest payments have gone way down. My interest payments have gone down from $12,000 a year to $4,000 a year, which is more manageable. So if I can do that, if I get somebody to finance me that way, then I'm in better shape. Because although I'm still in debt, I'm in less debt because I owe less interest. Remember, your total debt is what you owe plus the interest on what you owe. And if your interest is down, that means your debt is down. Plus, it also may mean that you can start paying off some of the principal. And once again, if you do find yourself in a really, truly unmanageable debt situation, which is like that you have no real hope of paying this off, then you should seriously consider bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is a real legitimate thing. Sorry. That's a, I mean, there obviously is some downsides to it. Once you declare bankruptcy, that's on your financial records, it's on your credit file. And, it's going to temporarily tank your credit rating, make it go down, and also make it harder for you to borrow money for things you might need, like a car. Going to also make it harder for you to do things like rent. These days, a lot of landlords, when you go to rent, check your credit. And if they see a bankruptcy on your credit, they're going to think you're probably not such a good risk to pay back your rent, to pay your rent on time. Things you might want to do will become harder to do for a few years, like rent a new place or buy anything with additional debt, like a car or a home or whatever. So you're probably going to have to put all that stuff on hold for a few years. But the good thing about bankruptcy actually is that in some cases it improves your credit rating. So if you've been falling behind on all your payments and not making payments and you're delinquent on a bunch of accounts, then your credit rating is already in the tank. You already have very low credit score. And bankruptcy sometimes actually improves it when you finish the bankruptcy process, because you're not allowed actually to accumulate additional debt during a period of bankruptcy filing and for some time after that. And so you actually become temporarily, at least, a sort of a better credit risk. So for those of you who are just constantly stressing about, completely unmanageable debt loads, as long as the debt is not student loan, because remember, you can't discharge student loan in bankruptcy. But if you have other kinds of debt, like credit card debts and medical debts, that kind of thing, and it's just causing you endless stress, and there's no way you're going to be able to dig out of it, realistically, in any foreseeable future, then bankruptcy is a pretty good option. That's what it's designed for. It's designed to give you a fresh start and allow you to start things over. But just keep in mind that for the first few years after you declare bankruptcy, there's going to be some things you're just not going to be able to get and not going to be able to do. Okay, so that's my take on good versus bad personal debt. The important takeaway for you here is that not all debt is bad. I sort of grew up in an era where they would say that any debt is bad debt, but that's not true. It depends on what you do with the debt is incurred by borrowing money, and it depends on what you do with the borrowed money. Our economy runs on borrowed money. That's how we start businesses. That's how we finance new ventures. That's how we finance investments. That's how we get education. That's how we get homes. If people had to pay all cash up front for all these things that we buy, that we might want to buy, these entire industries would collapse. Businesses would not get started. People would not be able to buy homes, buy cars. We would see entire industries just collapse into ruin. So, basically our economy runs on debt. I'm going to talk more about that in the second video. So, the reason for that is debt is not necessarily a bad thing. Debt keeps the money flowing, and it keeps, it allows us to do new investments, attain new careers, new education, get homes. So don't think of debt as by itself bad. It just depends on what you do with that debt and how that turns out, whether the debt is actually good or bad. Although there are certain forms of debt that really are always bad. But many forms of debt are not always bad. Some are quite good financially. So, you got to think about debt in a more complex way. Okay. Next video is going to be on national debt, which has got some similarities to this in that there's good and bad ways that a nation can go into debt. But national debt is a bit different. The risks and rewards are a bit different than personal debt. So I'm going to talk about national debt next. And thanks for joining the podcast.